Mark III has landed, but SG-1000 still has a few things to say. It's Segaiden episode 25. Into every Japanese vintage console, a little Pony Canyon must fall, if only by proxy. SG-1000's sole Pony Canyon creation, CISO, comes to us courtesy of Compile and Sega, the former having developed it and ported it over from MSX, and the latter, of course, publishing it. Pony Canyon has put in many appearances on Game Boy Works, but of course, CISO predates those releases by 4 or 5 years. This was one of the company's earliest original works for a console, developed by Compile and published by Sega after being licensed from the MSX release of the game. Sega and Pony Canyon appear to have shared some sort of relationship during the SG-1000 era, though I'm not exactly sure what that might have been. Pony Canyon published extensively on MSX, and their release schedule throughout 1984 and 85 included MSX versions of quite a few Sega titles we've seen here on Segaiden, including ZAXXON, Doki Doki Penguin Land, GP World, and Champion Boxing. Pony Canyon also seems to have tied up the MSX rights to some of the same licensed titles Sega landed for SG-1000, most notably the Activision lineup. They also published a Golgo 13 game for MSX, though it curiously wasn't the same shooting gallery title Sega produced. CISO stands out for being an original Pony Canyon production, as well as for marking the first appearance, so far as I can determine, of a familiar relationship from the NES era, Compile and Pony Canyon. In the US, collaborations between these two companies would appear under the FCI label, but basically, CISO comes to us from the same combo of interests that gave us the likes of Xanac and Lunar Pool. Anyway, it's interesting that after a couple of years of bringing Sega games to MSX, Pony Canyon would start to backport its own releases onto Sega's system. Maybe it simply shows that Sega had begun to check out where SG-1000 was concerned, and were happy to let Pony Canyon beef up the console's library at sunset so that first-party development efforts could focus more on Mark III support. Whatever the case, some pretty good SG-1000 titles resulted from this late-life initiative. CISO is not one of them. It's not bad, mind you, it just feels like a huge throwback. It looks, moves, plays, and sounds like a game from a few years earlier. In fact, I'd almost be tempted to say it was intended as a sequel to Pony Canyon's earlier platform action game Fruit Panic, which they later remade for Game Boy as TASMANIA Story. Well, maybe not a sequel, but perhaps a spiritual successor? Like Fruit Panic, CISO borrows a lot from Namco's MAPPY, namely trampolines, and involves collecting fruit and flowers while being pursued by hostile characters. This game does a lot more with a premise, giving the player a few options for evading and counterattacking pursuers. For one thing, it also borrows a bit from Chunsoft's Door. Every stage contains a few doors that you can duck into to emerge elsewhere on the level. I guess that's not really how Door works, but I still feel like there's a little bit of a debt owed here. Or maybe to Wrecking Crew. For another, you actually have to destroy enemies in order to complete a level. It's not enough to simply gather up flowers, you need to smash all your pursuers before you can move along to the next stage. Your pursuers have more or less the same abilities as your character, so they're capable of walking around, climbing ladders, and bouncing on trampolines. They chase after you somewhat relentlessly, with their behaviors varying according to the color of their sprite. I can't quite decide how those behaviors shake out in action outside of the enemies with yellow sprites, who don't hunt you down relentlessly, but rather prefer to mirror and parallel your actions. But in every case, touching any enemy equals an instant loss of life. Unless you happen to touch the enemy while leaping on a seesaw, in which case the game gives you a little mercy. The seesaws are the game's unique hook, hence the name. Seesaw is meant to sound like seesaw, basically, so that mechanic factors heavily into the action. Perhaps not as heavily as you might expect, though. You can really only use them to crush foes. Jumping on the raised end of a seesaw causes it to flip. If you can manage to flip a seesaw while an enemy happens to be at the lower end, you'll fling it into the ceiling and crush it. If an enemy happens to be walking beneath the raised end of a seesaw when you leap on it, you'll squash it. So basically you need to lure pursuers to seesaws and use those levers to annihilate them. Meaning this is definitely a game sending the wrong message to our nation's playground enthusiasts. There's no real point in smashing foes before you've gathered all the collectibles for the current stage though. Until you've picked up everything, new replacement enemies will continue to emerge from doors every time you destroy one. It's a decent enough premise for a game, though the stiff jump mechanics and somewhat fussy ladder controls bring it down. The levels grow in complexity pretty quickly with more avenues for enemies to catch you and more fruit to pick up. With refined, more nuanced controls and maybe some slightly nicer visuals and sound, I think CISO would hold up okay. but we're living in a post-Teddy Boy Blues world now, and this definitely feels last generation. In case you were wondering if Mark III's arrival would have a material impact on SG-1000, the answer is yes, and the case in point is the Castle, which walks back the SG-1000's move to the MyCard format in favor of a traditional cartridge, branded in the style of a Mark III release. The Castle reverts back to the cartridge format, shifting from the black tombstones of SG-1000 games past to the white plastic that will be seen throughout Mark III. This makes it a real oddity in the system's library, the only game of its kind to wear this specific Sega cartridge label. Why the change? My guess is that the Castle appeared on cartridge because it was simply too demanding for MyCard. This ASCII port from MSX is quite simply the biggest action game ever to appear on SG-1000. Developers really pushed the boundaries of the system here in its late life, and while the Castle certainly looks like the kind of games we've seen Sega peddling in terms of its visual design, beneath that surface it has more in common with European microcomputer games and the NES and Famicom's incipient Metroidvania push. In fact, NES fans may recognize the Castle. It shipped here in the US in a heavily modified form under the name CASTLEQUEST. The older iteration of the property lacks the comparatively detailed graphics and scrolling room structure of the NES game, but at its basic level it plays largely the same. The Castle debuted on MSX in April of 1985 and feels very much like an attempt by ASCII to channel the spirit of European microcomputer games like Jet Set Willy and Night Lore. Expansive, exploratory action games set across sprawling maps. It's not quite what I would call a Metroidvania, as your hero does not actually gain any powers during the course of the adventure, but you can definitely see its influence on something like Falcom's Legacy of the Wizard, which of course was a part of the Dragon Slayer family, a franchise that undoubtedly exerted its own influence on the Castle to begin with. The eponymous castle in which this adventure takes place consists of 100 interconnected screens set within a 10x10 grid, and it makes use of every possible pixel of the environment. The one gameplay upgrade our hero can acquire appears right at the outset of his quest, a map of the castle, which appears in the status bar and depicts your current location within the grid. Otherwise, the entire Odyssey consists of little more than collecting keys. The castle contains a ridiculous number of colored doors and keys whose color corresponds to them: blue, yellow, green, pink, and above all, red. The red keys appear in exceedingly scarce numbers, and a significant part of your quest involves simply locating them and the doors to which they belong. The 2 red keys have fallen into the hands of a pair of fairies who are imprisoned at the antipodes of the castle, and they unlock the final door behind which the obligatory princess has been stashed by the villain. Everything unfolds in reverse from this core objective. You need the 2 red keys to save the princess, and you need to find your way to the fairies in order to collect those keys, and each fairy is set behind a complex series of gates and traps. The castle therefore consists of making your way through the labyrinth, collecting keys, and optionally score-boosting treasures and potions that provide extra lives. This involves making your way back and forth through the various interconnections of the many rooms of the castle, evading monsters, and doing your best to avoid dying horribly to environmental traps. The game contains only about half a dozen different enemy types, each of which demonstrates predictable and consistent behaviors. However, as the protagonist has no powers of his own, you need to rely on the environment to help keep you safe. The various world hazards are as deadly to the bad guys as to your plucky prince. In order to destroy monsters, you usually need to Sokoban them to death by pushing or dropping a box onto them. You can also elevator action them by luring them onto an elevator, which works like a juice press at the extreme of its motion, crushing anything that happens to be aboard: monsters, hero, or even interactive environmental elements that you need to use as platforms. Pathways and even elevators often span multiple screens, and there are no bottomless pits here. If you see an opening, you can duck or drop through it, and you'll often need to in order to reach an out-of-the-way key or move to an inaccessible pathway. It's a difficult game, spanning 100 screens of potential death and giving you only about half a dozen lives, plus however many more you can collect via potions, in which to save the princess. The Famicom version, Castle Excellent, allowed players to use the Famicom data recorder to save their progress, while the NES localization just gave players 50 lives to manage. The castle offers neither, demanding you complete the entire adventure in a single sitting without making too many mistakes. I'd have to say this is the biggest shortcoming to the game, honestly. Making your way an hour into the adventure only to die at a tricky part, like the moving platforms that kill you if they hit you from the side and don't actually convey you unless you actively walk across them in time to their motion, can be deeply frustrating. Run out of lives and you have to start over from the beginning. That said, had I owned this game back in 1986, I can absolutely see myself dealing with the need to restart and try again over and over. The castle isn't nearly as primitive as it looks. Despite the stuttery movements of the characters, including your hero, who basically moves in half-tile increments, the action controls with surprising fluidity and precision. You have a lot of control over the hero's leaps, which can be extended for a few seconds by holding down the jump button, and whose trajectory can be altered in midair. It takes some time to get a handle on the quirks of the animation, especially when trying to guide the prince to a safe spot while in midair, but as long as you don't overthink it, it works well. Although it would be nice if the protagonist moved more smoothly, pixel by pixel, his relationship with the constraints of the tile grid works a bit like Lara Croft's in the early Tomb Raider games, allowing you to navigate deadly environments with perfect precision. Honestly, the castle represents a kind of game you didn't see a lot of on Japanese consoles. The closest analogs released in the US that come to mind to me are things like Versus the Goonies or MILON'S Secret Castle, which is no bad company for an SG-1000 release to belong to. At this point in the system's life, Sega's internal development for the console is more or less winding down in favor of Mark III, yet the castle falls into an impressive, ambitious string of late releases for the system that go a long way toward demonstrating the fact that it was capable of more than primitive arcade conversions. This is the best action-adventure release for the system, and it isn't even close. It's a shame it took developers so long to really find their groove for Sega's first console, but the nice thing about SG-1000 carts and cards was that you could still play them on Mark III, so even players who had left this platform behind could still savor the benefits. It's been a long time since I've talked about the SG-1000's Shitano. That is, the 4 Heavenly Kings of Terror, the 4 most expensive games on the platform. But we have a contender this week. Gulkave does not command prices quite as high as those of Pachinko or Space Slalom, but then again, few games do. I guess that's not so relevant anymore here in this age of pandemic in which prices of old games have absolutely skyrocketed, affecting even a largely unloved platform like SG-1000. But Gulkave is still one of the pricier titles in the console's library, even if it's no longer quite so unique in its ability to command 3-figure prices. It shouldn't be difficult to understand the reason for Gulkave's relative priciness. For one, it's a proper compile creation, not simply a conversion of someone else's game. And two, not unrelatedly, it's by far the best shooter on this system. Nothing else on SG-1000 even comes close, not even the mighty ZAXXON, which lacks the authoritative technical finesse compile invested into Gulkave. Once you see Gulkave in motion, you can easily understand the compile connection. This plays almost like a side-scrolling version of ZANIC, which made its debut on MSX right around the same time that Gulkave hit the SG-1000. Both games feature similar progressive power-up systems, and both games push their hardware beyond the limits of anything else seen to that point. You'll remember how I mentioned the Pony Canyon compile connection while talking about CISO, and that's the same duo that brought ZANIC into the world. Everything's a little circular in this business. Gulkave spans 30 stages, each distinct from the other, and bursting to the seams with background detail and moving objects that seem to surpass the innate limitations of the SG-1000 hardware. Although the action does occasionally demonstrate a little bit of Gradius 3 style slowdown, it's worth it for the way it throws a ridiculous number of enemies and projectiles around the screen at every possible moment. Enemy formations and attacks feel a little more fixed than in ZANIC, with ship patterns bubbling onto the screen according to predetermined arrangements rather than shifting to respond to your performance. Even without the dynamism of a ZANIC or, XEVIOUS, Gulkave's enemies always keep things interesting, with each fighter type behaving according to their own rules. Each foe does its own thing, and the level formations give you just enough time to grasp their distinct behaviors before combining enemy types to force you to deal with multiple threats at once. Some enemies simply streak past, while others appear to streak past until they hit the back edge of the screen, then reverse course, firing a potshot at you as they change direction. Others fly in pairs that come together once they line up with you, or drift harmlessly until they take damage from your forward fire, at which point they go aggro and cling to your ship, rapidly depleting your shields. Meanwhile, the game contains 8 different bosses that appear at the end of every few stages. These share much in common with legendary Wings bosses. They take the form of large structures that emerge from the right edge of the screen, all similar in design but loaded down with an ever-growing number of gun emplacements to increase the difficulty level. Take too long to defeat a boss, and it begins to send out Small Fry to chase you down and throw off your pattern evasion. As in legendary Wings, the bosses are pretty easy if you come equipped with an upgraded weapon, and a giant pain in the tuchus if you take them on with your default blaster. Speaking of blaster, the weapons system takes some getting used to. Although at first glance it appears to be fairly straightforward in the Hudson style, with each power-up icon you collect advancing your firepower to its next linear step, in reality it has a more convoluted structure. Enemies drop icons with numeric values, either 1, 3, or 5. These icons work almost like the value on a die on a board game, advancing your power however many steps are indicated by the number. The steps in question tie into the meter that appears at the bottom of the screen, a little bit like the power-up system in Gradius. You begin each new life with the leftmost square of the meter highlighted, and each time you collect a power-up icon, the highlight moves ahead the number of squares depicted on that icon and instantly activates the weapon associated with that square. Each square of the meter represents a different form of attack, and progression along the meter is not a simple linear matter in which you start with some basic single shots and end up with a huge screen-clearing Ultra Blaster, as in games like Darius Twin and, yes, Legendary Wings. Instead, weapon types appear in clusters of 2 or 3, and advancing beyond these groupings will shift your forward fire to a completely different type of attack. The most basic one-step progression will take you from single fire to rapid double fire to rapid triple fire, but beyond that you have more interesting attacks. There are large circles with a wide hitbox, a powerful triple chevron attack that clears the path of you with ease, a narrow but powerful laser, and more. Nothing in the game itself gives any clues to the workings of the meter progression, so this is a mechanic you need to look up in the manual and commit to memory. Moving from one weapon type to the next can often amount in a massive downgrade, so once you land on an optimal weapon, you may quickly find that your best power-up strategy is to avoid collecting icons at all costs. Naturally, you lose all your upgrades when you die, and you may find it difficult to bounce back after a wipeout, especially against bosses. One nice touch is that Gulkave, while challenging, does have pretty generous design. Not only can your fighter absorb a few shots with its shields, the game often sends you slightly forward to the next checkpoint rather than always sending you backward. You can't quite brute force your way to the end, but you don't need to worry quite so much about becoming trapped in an impossible situation that you can't fight your way out of with your default weapon. Well, outside of bosses, that is. With its complex mechanics, generous checkpointing, and frenzied action, Gulkave stands head and shoulders above any other shooter on SG-1000. This is a game that seems like it should have been impossible on this hardware, and yet here it is. It does at times push the console a little too hard. Besides the slowdown, you'll often fall afoul of overly busy backgrounds. While Gulkave never quite goes so far astray as Bombjack, some of the stages that feature detailed mechanisms down the center of the playfield make it difficult to spot and avoid tiny projectiles that get lost amidst the noise. Still, this is a momentous accomplishment and really feels like the culmination of Compile's 3 years of work here on SG-1000. The studio has been here since the very beginning, handling the 3 arcade ports from the console's launch and consistently cranking out solid to excellent releases ever since. And this is what all that practice led to. This won't be Compile's final SG-1000 title, but it's their final original creation for the system, and it brings the studio's expertise with the hardware and the MSX to bear on a game whose design and technical prowess point to the company's future. It's a shockingly great game, and unlike Pachinko and Space Slalom, it actually deserves to be enthroned as one of the console's 4 heavenly kings. Next time on Segaiden, the SG-1000 gets back to its roots as it makes a rally for the end.